Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming. We are here to discuss the heresy of secularism, a book by one of our guests, and discuss, let's say, two topics. First, the book, which we have recently published and whose author is here with us, and the problem of heresy itself. Our guests will share their thoughts on how contemporary ideas about secularity, rationality, and politics can be transformed by returning to the deeper roots of theological thought. I'm very pleased to welcome our guest. Today, second time in that place is our big friend and hero, John Milbank. It's a pleasure, John, to have you here.
Thank you very much.
John Milbank is Anglican theologian, professor emeritus at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham, founder of the Radical Orthodoxy movement. Mr. Milbank is of the most important contemporary theologian and the author of Theology and Social Theory, which we have published in Polish translation a few years ago. Here is it. And our second guest, the first time in that place, big pleasure to thank you very much for coming. Mr. Piotr Popiołek, Doctor of Theology and Religious Studies scholar, member of the Society of Dogmatic Theologians. He is also the author of The Heresy of Secularism. The book is the first monograph in Polish devoted to the thought of John Milbank. From this place, I would like to thank our donors who supported the publication of the book Heresy of Secularism, and also our partners from Block Press for broadcasting our debate on the internet. I now pass the microphone to Mr. Popiołek. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay. Before we go to the idea of radical orthodoxy and about its main thesis, I was thinking that maybe John could tell us something more about the roots, how this idea was born within him, like also in the contrast to the theological and philosophical climate which was on the Anglican universities by then, and to see because it was, for me, when I talk with John, when we look at it, it's something like a common experience, I think, also for Catholics as well for Protestants and Anglicans about the after Second Vatican Council, the popularity of liberal theologies and modern social sciences becoming more popular among theologians, which actually put the theology in the back, like it dominated the social thinking of theologians, and the part of the secular reason which dominated among theologians for a while, like which went to modern political theologies, in German political theologies, in liberal theology, in liberation theology, and so on. Those secular ideas were popular, and John's thought was crystallizing in opposition to this mainstream theology. And yeah, if you could tell us a little more about the beginnings.
Thank you, Piotr. Is this working? Yes. It's good. Yeah, well, I was hoping you could explain to me what radical orthodoxy was. Now you'd written a book about it. But seriously, it's a very great pleasure to be back here in these very, very comfortable offices. You must feel secure from everything up here, and a very good place to sort of think and reflect. Yes, well, trying to recall how radical orthodoxy was born in the 1990s, which seems like an incredibly long time ago now, in the era of Trump and so forth. I think it's rather as Piotr has indicated that it really all began in the 1980s when I was asked by the publisher Blackwell to do a kind of standard book about theology and the social sciences. And they thought they'd get a kind of 150-page book saying how important social science was for theology. And actually they got a book more like 420 plus pages saying there should be a theological critique of social science. And they were completely horrified and they didn't want to publish it. But fortunately, they sent it to the remarkable British Hegelian philosopher Gillian Rose, and she wrote back saying, "I think this book is entirely wrong. It's absolutely brilliant, and you've got to publish it." And so, deeply indebted to Gillian, who unfortunately died young, that it did actually see the light of day. And what happened was that when I started to work on the issue, I started to realize that, yes, as Piotr has explained, that we tend to have the situation where theology is sort of bowing to secular expertise. And so the idea was that you would be translating theological ideas into contemporary terms, or that somehow the use of this secular expertise would bring out the essential core of theology, perhaps in a way that somehow demythologized it, either that or conveying an eternal theological core in supposedly contemporary terms. And often those two ideas in a kind of contradictory mixture. So you've either got the idea that somehow the core of Christianity isn't really religious at all. This is partly the legacy of Bonhoeffer, or you've got the idea that you can readily separate a sort of religious nucleus of theology, the kind of thing you either get from Bultmann or from Tillich, and that it can be sort of newly translated into it has to be translated anew in every era. The second idea seems to have far too much the idea that sort of religion is in a separate area from everything else, that there is it's sort of cut off from all other areas and remains essentially the same. And it seems to be very wedded to a model of a sort of dualistic model of essential content and form in which it's presented, which doesn't seem to be at all true to reality. And especially if it's the case that God is a remote mystery that we can only talk about indirectly, then it would seem impossible to separate discourse about God from discourse about everything else. And one would rather tend to suggest that we only have a sense of God in terms of the difference our awareness of God is making to how we perceive everything else, and that there's no area of life immune from making that difference. And the first idea that the sort of the core of Christianity might be a secular message, a sort of crude Hegelianism, seems it seems in essence just like a decision to baptize the norms of today, and doesn't seem to have any critical edge. And so I sort of had those questions in my mind, but then when I started to look at the history of social thought, whether we're talking about politics, economics, or sociology, it seemed to me absolutely transparent that there are no innocent secular discourses. That to think that there are is to surrender to what Charles Taylor calls the subtraction narrative, that, you know, you have all this weird religious stuff, and then when you remove that, you're left with something natural and normative. And at that point, I was already very aware of postmodern discourses that were questioning humanism, never mind theology, and questioning the idea that we're kind of ever innocent of transcendent signifiers and so on. So it's the whole of liberal theology seemed to me to be very behind the times already, even in secular terms, that it hadn't really kind of caught up with Nietzsche saying, you know, things like we haven't got rid of God because we haven't got rid of grammar, and that kind of thing. And it seemed to me that the entire history of the social sciences, one could in fact see that there were buried theological assumptions, and these sciences and modes of knowledge were often linked to theological assumptions that might seem dubious from an Orthodox Christian point of view, that they might either be tied too much to, for example, to a voluntarist and nominalist sort of legacy, or alternatively to a kind of Gnostic legacy, or yet again, in the case of sociology, to a sort of buried Catholic traditionalist legacy that mutates from seeing the social order as laid down by God to seeing the social itself as the kind of ahistorical sacred thing. So the upshot of that was that it would be incredibly naive for theologians to imagine that these secular discourses were simply neutral and innocent, and that on the contrary, there might be an inherently theological politics, sociology, and economics, and so forth, in a way that perhaps people had thought more back in the 1930s. So again, when I was at Lancaster in the 80s, this was seen as altogether a bit weird, that I was not sort of simply praising liberation theology and so on. And but I was critical of liberation theology, not really because it was socialist or anything, far from it, much more because I think it was sort of baptizing secularity.
Too much not mystic.
And in a way, very conservative in sort of simply baptizing a westernized developmental kind of process. So when I got to Cambridge, and I was talking to various colleagues and students, the thesis started to get more generalized, you know, and we started to think about the assumptions of secular philosophy and even of secular science and psychology and so on. And so it was at that point that I suppose the movement got brought out towards
because after the book, when was your manifesto published? A little later, and
yes.
But actually, the group was crystallizing when you were in States already, or
No. The States was later.
Okay.
I moved from Lancaster to Cambridge. Radical Orthodoxy was born in the 1990s.
And already Graham Ward, Pickstock, like we put
yes,
genealogical groundwork for
yes,
to Scotus for you.
Yes,
like because at the beginning, like in the first edition of your book,
yes,
from what I remember, the sources for Scotus, for this idea, for him as a root of all evil in theology. Mostly it came from Gilson, right?
A little bit, but also from sort of more recent French and German research.
Boulnois was, I think, later.
Boulnois, yes.
And
so this was parallel. I think I mentioned on Scotus already in Theology and Social Theory, but this was kind of parallel to my thesis about the social sciences, that this was saying, well, actually, philosophy isn't innocent either, because there's a line leading from Scotus to Kant, and the assumptions made in Scotus about university of being, the priority of possibility over actuality, and the thing I'm working on at the moment, there's a third thing as well, that Scotus thinks that all 10 of the categories are kind of real in a way that Aquinas doesn't. So for Aquinas, an accident is a modal expression of substance, whereas Scotus thinks that each accident is a kind of universal reality in itself, and that is added to substance in a way that, as with his formal distinction and so on, sort of starts to somehow sort of break up the integrity of reality, and it thinks in a more kind of atomizing kind of way, and is very reluctant to recognize anything that smacks of a kind of Neoplatonic expressionism, that the substance is expressing itself through the accident, and this is an integral reality. And so in those three ways, and there are other ways as well, you can see how modern philosophy is built on this Scotist legacy and later a nominalist legacy, but that the reasons for this legacy in Scotus are often to do with theology. So that, the reasons for university are to do with, whether we can talk coherently about God at all. They're complexly bound up with his reasoning about the fall, his favouring of voluntarism is a kind of ultra-Christian suspicion of this Platonic kind of participatory legacy. And there are many other examples of that as well. So that the question starts to arise whether, if you do a genealogy of modern philosophy, that there are actually buried theological decisions, that are taken over by people for whom, theology itself is a complete load of nonsense.
Yeah, this is basically the main idea that those social sciences are cryptotheological, right? And
yes.
And inbound in, as you say, heretical theology of the Franciscans.
And in a way, when it comes to somebody like Kant, he's in a very difficult position, because as soon as you've said that being is univocal, you're tending to read being in terms of what we can sort of rationally grasp. And then ontology tends to invert into epistemology. But as soon as you've done that, you've got the profound problem of, well, where do our structures of knowing come from? And do we know things in themselves? And so immediately after Kant, really sort of nearly all the Germans say, yeah, these were great critical moves. And in a way, you can read Kant as having undone the entire sort of post-Scotist thing, you know, so that the metaphysics he's seeing as dubious is a sort of metaphysics of the understanding that's very much in this legacy and in this neo-scholastic legacy. So that in a way you can say Kant is doing a sort of important negative work, but you can't then turn Kant into a new foundation for philosophy and for philosophical theology in the way that right up to now Germans still tend to do. Mm-hmm. I think this is horribly naive compared to the great Germans, you know, the German idealists and the German romantics, who were far more aware that what Kant had done was profoundly ambiguous and problematic, and that you couldn't leave it there, you know, because it's leading us to skepticism, and it's leading us with a profound problem of how the mind relates to nature. So this is why today I'm working quite a lot on Schelling, and I'm increasingly convinced with all the new work done on Schelling that Schelling is in fact offering an essentially sort of Neoplatonic take upon Kant and a sort of critique of Kant that is arguing that you have to explain how mind emerges from nature on the one hand, and it's arbitrary to disallow the idea that we've got a sort of analogical intuition of the ultimate, so that Schelling is at once much more naturalistic than Kant is, and yet much more mystical than Kant is. And I think that all this resolves in the end in terms of a kind of Trinitarian ontology. But what we're realizing more and more is that the people who taught Kant, Schelling and Hegel and Hölderlin at the Tübingen Stift were profoundly Platonic. That they were, Ficino was on the syllabus. They were pietist Platonists, so that and they read also Hemsterhuis, the Dutch Enlightenment Platonist who was sort of mediating the Cambridge Platonists. So that we're really overturning a lot of the standard history here. That there is this kind of modern Platonic current.
Yeah, I wanted to go back exactly to this, like to this radical orthodoxy proposition for getting back to Christian Neoplatonism, to this to this line of tradition.
Yeah,
like through Augustine.
Yeah, I mean, what's
even Thomas.
What's important to say about the so-called Scotist narrative is that again and again and again we've been attacked as if we were eccentric and as if this was our weird thesis. It's not. The standard stuff by Scotist scholars in Germany and France says the same thing. That sometimes they're doing this in a very positive way, so what they are trying to say is that actually, there is a lineage from Scotus to Kant, because Kant is ultimately building on Scotus, and Scotus is, for them, a hero. But it's the same historical narrative, but being differently evaluated, if you like. And as you say, we've still got what is sort of at root a kind of Gilsonian. So when it comes to the question of Platonism, I think that besides this idea that theology is just sort of bowing to the secular, that sort of even Barth is really doing that because there's too much Kant in his philosophy. There are probably two other ideas that are crucial. There's first of all sort of agreeing with de Lubac that you shouldn't have a duality of grace and nature, that this is something very modern. It's not in the Fathers. It's not really in the High Middle Ages. It's not in Aquinas.
But you are going way back, not to Suarez, but
so this idea that pure nature the idea of pure nature is part of what's to blame for secularity. So it's not just a question of univocity and possibilism and so on, but it's also a question of pure nature. So that once you've started to say there is a side of nature that's complete in itself, which tends to be the case with the whole of sort of early modern scholasticism, you are creating a secular space. Yeah. So again, it's this idea that the secular space isn't there by subtraction. And actually, it's paradoxically the secular is invented by a bad theology.
Yeah, because it allows secular sciences, secular politics.
Radical Orthodoxy utterly deplores the return of neo-scholasticism in America, but to a degree in Poland and in other places. This is a massive mistake by people who don't want to think historically, who are ignoring or misunderstanding all the scholarship, and you know, basically just want to associate theology with the ahistorical. And it's the same mistake as the turn against sort of the romantic legacy of the Tübingen school, of the Catholic Tübingen school in the 19th century, which happened around the 1860s. And, you know, this return to a pure Aquinas, supposedly. But, of course, they misread Aquinas.
Yeah, because you focus on social sciences, politics, mostly political theologies, and currently going more deep into Trinitarian theology.
Radical Orthodoxy is concerned with the, you know, the whole gamut of things. You know, I mean, Connor Cunningham.
I wanted to say that there are a lot of people who, like you know, joined Radical Orthodoxy and you know went. They took their own subjects and you know they like Cunningham like focused on sciences, evolution, so on. Pickstock on genealogy, on Thomas Scotus, this critical analysis.
It's certainly concerned with
Goldchild,
you know, the question
Graham Ward.
secular assumptions across the board in these different range of disciplines and practices. But I think besides the Scotus story behind the questioning of nature, supernature, dualism. The third thing was a very powerful awareness of postmodernism, which I've already alluded to. Yeah. And I think this was definitely a point of tension in Cambridge in the 1990s. So during that period, we had the vote as to whether to give Jacques Derrida an honorary degree. So this was a minor cause célèbre in Cambridge at the time, with analytic philosophers like G.M. Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, bitterly opposed to giving an honorary degree to somebody they regarded as a philosophical charlatan. And on the other hand, an equally distinguished academic, but a literary critic, George Steiner, very much on the other side, saying, look, I don't agree with Jacques Derrida, but I acknowledge the subtlety and significance of his work. So some of my colleagues in the divinity faculty were taking Anscombe's side and saying, you know, this is a whole load of nonsense. And so, in fact, I met Brian Hebblethwaite. I voted to give Jacques Derrida the degree, of course. I agreed with George Steiner. And I remember coming out and Brian saying to me, John, you surely can't be supporting this load of froggy nonsense. I can't believe it. And anyway, so that, you know, that's kind of one side of England. But I suppose, you see, our reaction to postmodernism was, you know, that this is a movement that is suggesting that meaning is very unstable. You can never really be certain of what you're saying. That whatever you say, you may also be saying the opposite of what you're saying. And, you know, because every sign has to be qualified by a certain a further sign, you know, ultimate meaning is always postponed. So for us, we felt these kind of questions are perfectly genuine questions, that they can't simply be waved away. These are serious philosophical questions. But our response to that was precisely a Platonic response. So what our response was to say, yes, everything in this world is radically uncertain, but to kind of hypostasize uncertainty, to say, you know, therefore there is no meaning, or there is some kind of abyss at the heart of reality, is itself a dogmatic decision. Yet it remains always possible that we are making an analogical advance towards truth. But you need some kind of intuitive, almost mystical sense that is possible. So our case was very much that you have to make a sort of Neoplatonic response to this. You know, so particularly if you think in terms of the later Plato, where there are these sort of ultimate forms of the one and the indeterminate, and there's an interplay between the two, and there's no certainty on the level of our discourse in this world. You've got to appeal to a participation of this kind of interplay into a kind of point of identity in the intelligible world, where the one and the many are identical with each other. I mean, you can see why I've got this sort of sympathy, with Schelling, that's sort of developed more recently. But I think this is why sort of participation has become so sort of very, very central to what radical orthodoxy is doing. And that was kind of true from the outset, that we thought, and also allied to that, and you can think of Catherine Pickstock's work here and the work of her current student, Sylvain Toussaint, who's also sort of drawing on me in a very strong way. Sort of the insistence that we need to think of participation in a kind of post-Renaissance and a post-Romantic way. In other words, we need to have a strong awareness that nature is in flux, a kind of metamorphosis, that humans are creative, that there's a historical process that's constantly changing, so that this gives great prominence to the notion of poesis, of the notion that we're not, that human thought is like art. It's not sort of pre-modeled. We're kind of groping by doing things and making things. We're kind of groping towards an end that only gradually emerges through that creative process itself. And again, what I would now say is that German Romanticism is incredibly important here, because it's as if we're always going from the unconscious through to the conscious, where we're always going from very mysterious nature towards this sort of artistic expression. So I think it's more and more come to the fore, although this was true from the outset, that we're looking for an alternative modernity rather than simply going back to the Middle Ages. Yeah. In other words, we're insisting that this kind of Renaissance awareness of creativity and kind of dynamism in nature can be thought more Neoplatonic.
Yeah, I think this is one of the parts of your critics that they accuse you of being actually pre-modern and not postmodern, like Caputo or I think some of the Polish interpreters also.
Yeah, but Caputo is just sort of doing another version of the thing I've criticized all along. You know, instead of sort of baptizing humanism, he's now sort of baptizing sort of Derridean skepticism, and sort of sacralizing. And to me, this is sort of Sartrean bad faith in extremists, you know, to carry out that sort of action. And I mean, why not just be a kind of honest Derridean, if you like? But I think the, you know, the relationship of Aro to pre-modernity is yes, very complicated, because in some ways we're certainly saying that the pre-modern didn't have these kind of hard and fast certainties, sort of rationalistic certainties that modernity has. And in one sense, that's almost saying the pre-modern is not quite what you think. And, you know, I mean, various forms of authoritarianism and absolutism and so on are noticeably modern. You know, medieval kingship was constitutional, for example. But at the same time, I don't think we're at all saying, you know, whether in metaphysics or society, that we should just go back to the Middle Ages. And I've tried to say why I think that's not the case, because I do think there's a kind of Renaissance awareness that you can't undo. And I think that sort of the modernity that we're critical of tends to take two different moves. It sort of either absolutizes the human subjects, or it absolutizes the cosmos. So, you know, to do shorthand of this, it's either Kant or Spinoza. And again, the interesting thing about the German Romantics and Schelling is their tendency to say, well, neither can be the right solution. If you absolutize the human subject, you're left with kind of skepticism and no account of where our knowledge comes from. If you absolutize the cosmos, you tend oddly to land up with a kind of dualism. You land up with a dualism of sort of, is the whole of reality the only reality, or are there sort of particular things within reality the only reality? Is it the substance or is it the modes? So one of my very strong theses that runs right through my work, and people don't always find it easy to get hold of, is that I think immanence is dualistic and transcendence is monistic. So what I mean by that is, if you think everything derives from the one and from a creator, essentially this is a monism. Or it's the most monistic you can be. Even though sort of finite reality is real and individuals are real, they are from the one. And by the way, it seems to be the case that it's only misreadings of Indian Vedanta that cause you to think that they're denying there are actual individual realities. That doesn't seem to be true of Shankara and so on, which means that probably that kind of Advaita is quite close to Neoplatonism and so on. And if I'm sounding a bit perennialist here, then I am sounding a bit perennialist. But so that the contrast to that is that I think as soon as you have an immanentism, you tend to have a contrast between something immanent that is stable and something immanent that is either fluid or unreal. So, for example, Aristotle is much more dualistic than Plato, and Plato is much more materialist than Aristotle. The German Romantics, again, grasped this extremely well. Why am I saying that? Because in Aristotle, you tend to make substance absolute, and you tend to make matter a sort of alternative, chaotic source of reality.
External. Yeah.
And you also, Aristotle says that kinesis or movement is not quite real. It's sort of, he can't quite account for motion, or he oscillates on that, because he says motion is always breaking down into potentiality or actuality, which means he doesn't quite have a place for motion. So you've got, within immanence, substance is the real thing, and somehow motion and matter are subordinated. So none of that is in Plato, and this is why Plotinus's Ennead 6, this masterful assault on Aristotle, well, where he incorporates what's good in Aristotle, but also goes beyond it. You know, we tend to think that Plotinus is some kind of woolly mystic, but this is Ennead 6 is absolutely rigorous. And what he's trying to say here is that matter is just as real as intellect, so that both matter and intellect, and matter and substance, and substance is sort of less perfect in this world than it is for Aristotle. All these things participate in a higher realm. So for Plotinus, there is no subordinate dualism within immanence, because all of it, there's a higher matter, there's an intellectual matter, there are higher forms, there's a higher motion. The intellectual world is in motion, and the one is beyond the contrast of matter and motion. So part of what I'm trying to do at the moment is to build up a Trinitarian ontology that's much more Plotinian. This is why it's sort of going beyond Aquinas, because you've got to take kinesis much more seriously as a kind of ultimate category. So the same thing would apply for me to Aristotle as it would apply with Spinoza. But there's always, as Conor Cunningham has put it, there's a sort of danger that you'll see pure substance in itself as nothing, or the modes in itself as nothing. Now, I think Spinoza probably, I agree with now a bit more with Herder, he was probably trying to have a sort of an absolute God beyond the world, but he'd sort of lost the way to do that because he no longer has this structure of analogy and participation. So I think that what you're getting with the Romantics, who are kind of realist philosophers, and with Schelling, is that they're saying something like, you can't have an absolute within this world, either in terms of the human subject or in terms of the total cosmos. There's an interplay between natural blind processes and subjective spiritual processes that is rooted in transcendence. And then the further really subtle and crazy thing that Schelling does is to sort of suggest, partly using Jakob Böhmer, that the sort of God himself is a kind of advance from the natural unconscious towards consciousness in a kind of supreme art. But because that happens eternally and instantaneously, it's perfectly compatible with an orthodox sense of God. But essentially what Schelling is getting rid of is entirely any idea that God is some kind of rational planner, in which case he might be a sort of computer. He's trying to get to a much more biblical, much more personal God. And that means that we need to think of all thinking as more like artistic expression. So it's got to be emergence, like the emergence of the Son from the Father, and then the sort of the integration of the conscious and the unconscious. I
want
yeah.
I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But based on the what those ideas and on the impact of the radical orthodoxy, because I was wondering if it's like when you look back and currently, like, was the impact bigger on theology or actually on our continental philosophy?
On
theology or our.
Gosh, that's a very difficult
because I sometimes think like it's when you look at mostly for example positive responses are, I think they are more often from philosophy than from theology.
Yeah, I think that could easily be true. I think theologians on the whole in England and America are extremely angry because it was like sort of saying the thing you do that's bringing in the money is kind of invalid.
Because mostly, like, Dominicans, most of Dominicans, I think, don't agree with your interpretation, Thomas, and Pickstock's interpretation. And also, like, of course, Franciscans hate you because of Scotus.
Well, they can't. They're Franciscans. They have to love us. They have to love everybody. They just weep. They're just crying. you know.
Yeah.
But some Dominicans. I mean, the kind of red Dominicans of Bologna like us.
You also attacked them for creating capitalism in this essay.
Oh,
you
the
remember?
Franciscans.
Yeah, you remember.
Yes. well, by a paradox, yes, because if sort of all property ownership is evil, then it might as well be capitalist. Is roughly, and that I do think is genealogically the case. Yeah, I mean, I think it's with Dominicans, it's kind of got more like that because with sort of reaction against Vatican II, and as you say, this is ironic because in some ways, some interpretations of Vatican II, very liberal ones, Rana, and I'd be critical of as well. But I think it's a bit like Trump saying there's something wrong with liberalism, and then heading off in a direction that it does look rather fascistic. That's. I know it's become thought to be unsubtle to say that, but similarly, you sort of say, well, it's all gone wrong, so let's go back to manual scholasticism. Yeah. And seriously, this is not. I think the right answer, but I think you're right that to some extent because we've been engaging with contemporary philosophy and so on, and we've been directly engaging their debates. We've been. I mean, I wouldn't want to exaggerate this at all, but I think we've enjoyed rather more reading outside theology than most theologians. I mean, people like Marion and so on in France, that's true of as well, and probably to a greater extent.
Some of the ideas, like some of the theses, like this genealogy, like the Scottish story, was broadly accepted. I think, like it's of course it's controversial and so on, but I think like when you look at Charles Taylor and so on, but it's this narrative
and what we are saying sort of blends quite nicely, I think, with what Charles Taylor is saying, and we're certainly not claiming we've got a sort of exhaustive genealogy for secularity. You'd need to add the kind of things that Charles
and the same
Taylor
like the thesis about
like
cryptotheology in social sciences. I think it is also mainly accepted. Like, okay, you have like this theological pre-understanding of
I think also when we were back in the 1990s, this looked far more weird than it does today. That in many ways a sort of questioning of who we are and whether we're really post-Christian. You've got things like Tom Holland's book Dominion, although he's an agnostic, sort of church-going agnostic, but he says, well, we're just ineluctably Christian. If you produce a pop song called "Love Is All You Need," it comes from ultimately a Christian culture. And so I think that the questions we were raising then seem a lot less controversial now.
But for theologians, I think still like the thesis about theology of meta-narrative is still controversial for a lot of them.
Yes, I think definitely so. The idea that your ultimate orientation is theological, and that this makes a critical difference to all other
division from social sciences and sciences in general is much more comfortable, like for theologians, I think, because they don't have like to care about it.
no, that's right. But probably ideas about a sort of ultimate narrative basis. But I think, that's just a way of saying that sort of mythos is not separated from logos, and that there isn't an ultimate duality of faith and reason. And you can call it theology, you can call it philosophy. But I mean, ultimately, if you can't say anything about the absolute, it sort of relativizes all the other claims that you make. You know, you can do very careful phenomenological descriptions, or you can say more precisely how language works or what our knowledge is. But you haven't really touched on that issue of ultimate truth, I think. So that in a way, again, this is very Schellingian, that sort of philosophy, to be philosophy, must be concerned with the most difficult questions, like, is there anything absolute? What's the relationship with the one and the many? Why, you know, why has variety come to be at all? And these are like almost impossible questions, and yet really they are the ultimately serious philosophical questions. You know, if philosophy is not trying to answer those questions, it becomes sort of translatable into other discourses. And I think it's also at that point that the distinction between philosophy and theology tends to break down. And when one thinks about all the serious 19th century thinkers like Schelling, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Ravesson, all of them, you can't any longer really distinguish whether they're doing philosophy or whether they're doing theology.
Yeah, the implication is that basically theology, and the thing which is not comfortable for a lot of people, that theology can and should like tell you something about society and politics.
Yes.
And I think this is the thing which is for many people today, like mostly because of populist politics and very often like using religious languages. That's something, you know, seems even scary for a lot of people, like, you know. So
yeah.
I think for this reason, the proposition of radical orthodoxy is.
But I think all the more reason we need this perspective, because I think that what's happening in our own time is that people have become very, very alienated from a supposedly neutral secular discourse, you know, that tends to talk in very elite, supposedly scientific and objective terms, and seems to a lot of people to be very much the discourse of people who live on a kind of globalized level, and sort of don't care about the lives of and experiences of ordinary people, that this can be kind of sacrificed. So I think people have become very suspicious of a neutral sort of rationalist discourse, and this is driving populism. But the problem is that people then take refuge in something very atavistic. You know, it's all very well and good to say we need to focus first of all on the local. You know, that's one part of the order moris that we've been debating about. But to say that then, you know, the bounds of our moral concern are our nation, you know, is incredibly dangerous.
That's not very Augustinian.
It's certainly not, and you're not getting to the end of the story of the Order Moris, you know, as the Pope was no doubt trying to point out to J.D. Vance. So in our own day, we're seeing the instrumentalization of religion, aren't we, everywhere? You know, it's being used to support nationalism, you know. Probably in Poland as well, this happens. And I think, so we've got to, we need a third way in relation to liberal globalization and to this kind of instrumentalization of religion as nationalism, that religions are naturally linked to civilization levels, you know. They're not linked to Russia or to America. Christianity is linked to all these countries. And then, you know, a similar thing with the other major religions of the world. But and then when you've got to that level, you have to say, well, the history of religions is complicated, that religions are definitely different from each other, but they're not totally different, and they're all internally syncretic and eclectic in their origins, you know. And I mean, it was possible for Al-Ghazali to read Dionysius the Areopagite and to learn from him, you know. So when we've got to the civilizational level, I think we get to a level where we need to say, yeah, we agree on some things and differ on other things, you know, and there need to be different areas where we develop things differently, just as within Christianity that's true as well. But deploying religion for the sake of nationalism seems to me incredibly dangerous, and having excessive doctrines of national sovereignty, sort of absolutizing those doctrines of national sovereignty, seems to be bad as well, you know. And that, you know, that's a negative side of the sort of modern liberal legacy, and after the breakdown of Christendom and so on. So I think, yeah, I think it's very important that there exist movements like Radical Orthodoxy and things like them that are able to understand why sort of secular liberalism is in trouble, but don't want to endorse these very sinister answers, you know. And in a way, we are in a similar position to Christians in the 30s, that where a lot of Christians were disillusioned with liberalism and tempted towards fascism or communism or phalangism in Spain. But like the most sophisticated voices like Barthes and Simone Weil and Emmanuel Mounier and Jacques Maritain were saying, no, we have to look for a third thing. And I feel we are rather kind of back in that moment. And I've been dismayed by in America how sort of like people I initially felt were saying similar things to me about politics, like sort of Patrick Deneen, and, you know, seem to have just got carried away by the triumph of Trump, you know, and it's as if they're on high or something. I mean, I thought J.D. Vance was supposed to be an intelligent man, but, you know, even in terms of what he's trying to achieve, he seems to have said absolutely things that are alienating people who might otherwise support him. And I think there's a very, very dangerous drift here, you know?
Yeah. I think we'll go to the questions now.
Yes.
The mic, yeah. A question taking us a bit further in time than the present chaos we are experiencing. So a question about the future of religion, if the options in, say, 20 years' time are really secularism and a kind of politicized Christianity used for a shortcut nationalistic purposes, because on the, say, broadly speaking, liberal left, there is this tendency towards, you know, going more into mystical, ecological, pagan thing. On the right, there's this kind of Nietzschean, pagan, masculine thing. And again, and this is my guess, what would you say, that in 15 years' time we'll see a big return to institutional churches, Anglican, Catholic, some other Protestant churches, because, speaking in solely sociological terms, out of this chaos, people will look for stability that neither of those conflicting forces were able to provide, especially when we come to questions of AI that are ultimately about consciousness, conscience, and soul.
Yes, brilliant comments. I think, sorry, yeah, those are really superb comments. I think particularly the latter point that, you know, if secularity is able to give no account at all of the spirit and the soul and freedom, then there's a sense in which religion runs with people's common sense, everyday experience. It's you know, you really can't get rid of God because you can't get rid of grammar, because you know, people assume that sort of things like conscience and freedom, the law courts assume it, you know, for one thing. And I do think it is possible that religion will make a comeback because it's a discourse about the soul. But it obviously needs to have a sort of robust metaphysical account of why that's true. And the other thing you suggest is interesting as well, that the liberal left may go sort of more and more into sort of pagan, new agey thing. And then the right may go off into a much more Nietzschean pagan thing. So that it, you know, at that point, again, it becomes possible that Christianity starts to look like the sort of sane middle ground. It's not impossible. Yeah, so that the sort of the current sort of using of Christianity might sort of fade away, you know, and there's certainly a faction in the far right that thinks Christianity is just inherently communist, you know, you know, it's not for real men and all this kind of thing, you know. So, but just one further comment there would be that, yeah, that may happen, but I think currently the way we're saturated by media and social media all the time means that all of us, and I'm including me here, have got are in real danger of sort of politicizing our religious commitment all the time. Of, you know, being so obsessed with particular contemporary issues and what side we're on, we forget the much deeper stuff. And I do think churches have got a responsibility to sort of keep people in prayer groups, discussion groups, Bible study groups, devotional groups that kind of correct this. You know, it's, I mean, I consume way too much news. You know, part of my excuse is that I'm a bit involved with politics, but I still think it's unhealthy.
Thanks very much. This has been a very interesting sort of theological, philosophical discussion. And my background is a bit different because I do history and I do legal research. So I'm really interested in the things that we can and cannot do practically, politically, legally. And what Trump has changed, I think, is he's broadened the Overton window of what we can do, which previously under this liberal philosophy, we thought we couldn't do these things, and now we can. And I sort of operate more on the conservative side of things in England. And on the conservative side in England, people are increasingly saying, what are we going to do with the migrants? You're going to have to just like take all the illegal immigrants and put them away somewhere. And this is concerning because how do you think we are shifting now in the things that we can and cannot do? What's the change in philosophy there?
Well, it's a really great question, and possibly like you, I feel quite ambivalent about it, because I do think that there's a sort of excessive liberal bureaucratic sort of mentality that stops us doing things because we're following procedures all the time, and that prevents us taking really urgent actions about things. But at the same time, I worry that, you know, as so often, we're now veering off in the opposite direction. You know, today's anti-wokery, and I'm incredibly anti-woke, but it quickly becomes tomorrow's actual racism and misogyny and so forth. And I do think we can already see the dangers of that, you know. And yeah, I think we do have to ask about the role of the bureaucracy in the civil service, and is it democratic? Is the British civil service fit for purpose? People like, I mean, I hear that even people on the left hear Dominic Cummings and start to agree with him now. So I you know, and again, let's defuse some of these debates. You know, there is a real debate to be had here, but whether what Elon Musk is doing now, which it often involves, you know, tough-looking bouncers turning up to your office and turning you out and getting your papers, it does, you know, it does start to look a little bit fascistic, you know, and deporting migrants, you know, can that be done without cruelty, including cruelty to children? I mean, I think for certain we've had too liberal immigrant policies. And I think most sane people, I'm more on the left, but I think most sane people on the left, like in Social Democrats in Germany, see that. I mean, after all, you know, we get immigrants because we don't pay our own workers enough, you know, and they'll do the job. See, excess immigration is exploiting everybody. It's not some kind of, you know, liberal good, which I think the Pope too much tends to see it that way. You know, it's not as simple as that. So, in a way, Trump has he's sort of burst the woke bubble. He's started to see that quick action can be taken. Yeah, that might have its good side. It might free us up to, but I suppose I think, yeah, there can be more subtle solutions. I mean, it's like the whole question of tariffs. Yeah, I mean, the trade between the US and Europe probably is unbalanced, you know, where it's in terms of export imports, you know, but why not? You know, the German economy is in trouble anyway. Why not do this in maybe this is sentimental, but I do think there can be a mutualist approach to tariffs, you know, rather than, you know, the alternatives are not just free trade on the one hand and a tariff war on the other hand. There could be, you know, trade negotiations, and but making it sound as if, you know, the good of America is absolute in like Trump's Congress speech. I found it frightening, you know, to say that so openly. And also it completely undercuts all goodwill towards America. And I think actually British conservatives, this has been a moment of truth for them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The great fallacy of British people is that we tend to think that we are America. We write about America as if we were America, and we are not America. America often, well, not often, occasionally, maybe often, acts against our interests. I've just bought a very interesting book called Vassal State that I'm very excited to read about how sort of, America's sort of making money off England, you know, Britain, Europe.
Yeah. Well, I've lived in America for 7 years, and Americans have only the vaguest notion of what Britain is like. And anybody who's lived in America for any length of time quickly realizes just how European we are.
I can't wait to go.
Inside the EU or not, we are Europeans. Americans don't kind of live in villages. They don't live in towns. The center of their cities are sort of empty. It's an incredibly different pattern of life, and the more it gets southernized, the more different it's becoming. And because we speak you know, you're lucky in Poland. We speak the same language as Americans, and therefore we're incredibly vulnerable. And it goes on. It gets worse all the time. I mean, 2 years ago, I was eating nice food in Heathrow. 2 days ago, it was kind of only American food. You know, it was all burgers. You know, and
I think
and I think American food is awful. Right?
Oh yeah, but, Britain is like a hybrid. It's sort of half like America and half like Europe. We have to sort of carve some position that's bridging the two. That's our natural role.
Well, it shouldn't be difficult. We're a little more individualist than Europeans. But
much more, I think. Much. I'm half Polish and half British, so I sort of always.
I think we are a lot more. We're more argumentative and so on. But I think we're more associative than Americans. Much more, having lived in America.
That's true.
It's sort of, a stronger sense that we're doing things for each other, and a kind of shared identity. And
the dark side of that, though, is class consciousness. It's working class kids who don't think that they can become entrepreneurs, which they don't hold themselves back that way in America, and they do in Britain, and they don't in Poland either, by the way.
That is interesting. That is interesting, although I tend to think that it's a complicated subject, because I think
I'll catch you on it later. How about that?
I think American women despise working class women just like Hillary Clinton, and I think American men tend to despise American. I mean, in Britain, the class thing. We've got things that mediate it, like sport and talking about cookery and things like this. And this is my conservative side. I don't think you ever abolish hierarchy, and I think that you do need good hierarchies, and you need good hierarchies at every level. And I'm all in favour of working class people becoming entrepreneurs, but I suppose I'm much more interested in the idea that they could lead decent lives as working class people. I mean, most people will, by that standard, most people are going to fail. Why do we see social mobility as such an absolute? You should be able to live a decent life as a plumber, a cleaner, and so on, because we need all of those roles. I mean, I agree we need to get rid of the bad side of the British class stuff. But I do think we need much greater acknowledgement that life is not all about going up the ladder.
Yeah, this is a post-industrial phenomenon. It wasn't the case in an aristocratic society.
No, that's completely the case. Nor was it the case that nobody ever made it in the Middle Ages. That's rubbish. The priest sees the peasant can read easily, and they go up the ladder. I mean, Thomas Cromwell was a butcher's son.
Thomas Cromwell was my hero.
Oh, no.
I'm at his inn of court. I'm at
Oh, God. So. No. Dear. You've got a bad case of mantulitis. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. You encouraged us not to be fixed on politics, so my question goes back to the theory a little bit.
Yes, good.
Do you know such a movement in social science, critical realism? Roy Bhaskar, for example.
Yes.
And if you could say anything about the relationships from your perspective to radical orthodoxy.
It's so many years since I read Bhaskar that I'm not sure I can really remember enough. Can you sort of ask me a more sort of
maybe
leading
I will
question?
Explain why I have asked about this. So I'm quite well interested in this critical realism. It is especially well developed in the sociology. They try to demonstrate, in my opinion, the same ideas that you present from theological perspective.
Yeah.
For example, that social science should be not fixed on some kind of methodological atheism.
Yeah.
There is space for transcendence also in sociology.
Yeah.
So that's why I was interested in your theology before, and now I moved to more sociology and critical realism, and I in fact find a lot of common space.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. I remember I felt quite favourable about Bhaskar, but I'm not sure I can. I can I can fully remember exactly why. I mean, I suppose that, yeah, typically sort of, you know, a qualified realism can have the sense that you're, you know, does it really escape from that sort of Kantian dualistic space, you know, that we're endlessly sort of trying to model a reality that sort of eludes us in some way. Whereas I think that, you know, the important thing is to realize that there isn't a sort of gulf between material reality and the realm of thought, that sort of everything is teleologically directed towards the realm of thought. That it, I mean, that, you know, matter may be a sort of dark horizon, but it's not something that we're sort of getting ever near, or even sort of incrementally. It's much more that we tell the ultimate truth about the material reality through thinking it. So I suppose that's a little bit more idealist, probably. I mean, it's a kind of ideal realism. But I think it's very important to try to escape what Alfred North Whitehead called the bifurcation of nature, the idea that our thoughts and our emotions aren't fully part of the natural world. You know, I think they are sort of disclosing it, you know, so that I don't think this is probably, you know, the sort of critical realism sort of Marxist thing. I don't think it's only the case that we have to see to sort of be on guard against our ideological prejudices in the face of the real. I mean, I think that is true, but I think we need to also hang on to the idea that reality is something finished, that we are called sort of eschatologically to complete. It's a sort of, would be a sort of updating of sort of the Aristotelian Thomist idea that, you know, the forms in things become eventually forms abstracted in us. You know, that so that there's a continuity between sort of reality and our thoughts, whereas the danger of modern thinking is to suppose that they're sort of inherently alienated from each other because you've lost the idea of the unity of creation. That's not probably a very apt answer, but it's the best I can do.
Do we have more questions from the public?
John, you talked about danger of politicizing religion. Do you agree with quite widespread opinion, and I think with well evidence that there is a danger for freedom of religion in Western countries, especially the university sphere?
Yes, yes, I do. I mean, I felt that sort of J.D. Vance's remarks the other day were unfortunate only in the sense that they were exaggerated, you know, because, you know, the leaders of European countries don't systematically murder their opponents and send them to gulags, so that, you know, the idea that
but they systematically ignore martyrdom of Christians around the world, for example.
No, this is where, as I say, the exaggeration troubled me because, you know, some of the things he was saying were true and needed to be said in a more sober voice, and also in a voice that doesn't imply that they're only happening in Europe, because, you know, they're most certainly they're not only happening in American universities, they were imported from American universities. And so, you know, I'm an academic and I work in that world. But Yeah, there are dangers definitely dangers to free speech in American universities. In British universities, I mean, my wife and I have nearly twice got into terrible trouble over the trans issue, for example, when we were only expressing views that have become more and more the norm. In other words, that it's extremely dangerous to do irreversible operations on teenagers, you know. So we weren't really saying anything extreme, but there was certainly a period of time where that was regarded as sort of equivalent to racism or misogyny or something like that. And similarly, the thing with, I mean, I don't agree with Nigel Biggar, now Lord Biggar, about everything, but I think his book on empire, I don't agree with all of that either, but I don't think it's particularly unreasonable. It's kind of saying there were good things and bad things about European empires. That should be something that a university is debating. A university should not be committed to the idea that, you know, European empires were all bad. I mean, maybe they were, but a university shouldn't be taking, a university needs to be as open as possible within, and again, the trouble is you go from one extreme to another, that if you don't allow free debate, then some people who really believe in racialized science and so on will make grounds on, they will make advances by joining the free speech cause. So again, you get a very, very dangerous kind of polarization. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think things to do with gender and sex and post-colonialism and all this, you know, it's become very intolerant. And I think much worse than that, it's the syllabus has become so narrow. I mean, in schools, for example, in English literature, it's like you just read every text in terms of a feminist narrative, a race narrative, a post-colonial narrative, and so on. And like, whatever your politics, this is appallingly narrow. You know, a Marxist from the 1970s wouldn't have been happy with this. So, you know, something very bad has definitely, is definitely happening. And yes, I think that tolerance of people taking religious positions, people being fired from their jobs, this is undoubtedly happening. And what Darius is mentioning, above all, maybe the ignoring of Christians being persecuted. Christianity is the most persecuted religion. Our media has said almost nothing about, you know, the sufferings of Christians at the hands of Islamist extremists in Africa, and you know, what has happened to Christians in the Near East is absolutely horrendous, and this just hasn't made it into our press. And you know, we need a de-racialized set of norms. You know, it's like, I mean, again, you know, I hold no brief for the motivations of Elon Musk, but there's no question the grooming gang scandal was appalling. That the police ignored what was happening to white working class people, white working class girls, because of fear of upsetting race relations. And this is very, very, very bad indeed. But, you know, our kind of left and centre-right politics has sort of neglected these the issues of the common good, the things that affect most people, that most people who don't fall into identity minorities and so on, their welfare has been neglected. And so, you know, populism hasn't arisen just by accident, you know, and they are sort of answerable for the fact that we now have Trump and Vance and so forth, you know, and maybe we were all giving them the benefit of the doubt, but the other day they looked like these are criminal thugs. That's what it looked like. So yes, yeah. Again, I think we need a third, much more responsible voice. But I don't think any of the churches have been very good at trying to articulate that.
Okay, I think we can finish our meeting now. Thank you all. Thank you, John.